Number 10. This church's tyranny is, alas, too evident from the many repeated and reiterated acts thereof in all corners of the kingdom, as in many other things, so especially in planting vacant churches, of which many instances might be given, such as in the affair of Kettle, Peebles, Carnwath, Livingston, Bathgate, Aberdour, Yarrow, Marbattle, Gladsmere, Shotts, Kelton, and Glasford, the parish of Eccles and Houghton in Merse, of Linton in Tweedledale, of Old Maker at Aberdeen, and Westkirk at Edinburgh, Dunbar, Eglisham, Cambuslang, St. Nenans, Innerkithington, Finwick, etc., etc., with many more. And what scandalous, subtle, fraudulent ways, pains, and violence used to get these creatures, greedy of filthy lucre, settled and thrust over the belly of the people, who had just exceptions against such thieves and robbers, not only because they did climb over the wall upon the presbytery's shoulders, otherwise they could no more have passed it, than have mounted up to Simon's world of the moon, but also because of the many immoralities in some, errors and insufficiency, etc., in others, some of the respective presbyteries themselves being judges what base methods have been used about settlements, what clubbing, fighting, dragooning, and violently persecuting poor people in parishes for opposing the settlements of such hirelings, and, on the other hand, what opposition many honest and godly people met with, time after time, from ministers and judicators, in their just right of calling their own ministers, is so very discouraging, that many have given over and do cease to contend with them, and are resolved to let them go on in their career until their cup be full, because they refuse to be ashamed and revolt more and more. Yea, what cruel treatment some more honest than themselves have met with from these tyrannizing gentlemen, that are so servid and furious in driving on defection, both before and since patronages were reimposed, as in the case of Mr. Alex Shields, whose blood it is to be feared this church has to answer for if Uriah's was charged upon David, Mr. Mayer, Mr. Clarkson, and Mr. Gabriel Wilson, for his preaching against their evil ways, with many others, is so very shocking and unaccountable, that an impartial history of such facts as above hinted would scarce be thought real. And was not Messrs. B and B, some time ago, on account of refusing a presentation by the Assembly, declared or rendered incapable of receiving a presentation on the north of Tweed? Was not Mr. Gillespie deposed by General Assembly 1752 for preferring the dictates of conscience to an ecclesiastic mandate of assisting at a violent settlement, and some of his brethren of the presbytery were deprived of their seats for some time in judicatories on the same account, which gave air to the rise of the relief party? Was not Mr. Findlay cashiered into an acknowledgment and rebuked at the bar of the General Assembly 1775 for settling Mr. Thompson to the stipend, but not to the charge of St. Ninians? The casuistical essay, page 60 and 61, says, quote, "The way of entry into the ministry and settlement in a particular charge cometh likewise under necessary consideration. When the essentials are vitiated, the relation cannot be owned, and it is haunting, in this case, cannot be justly blamed, especially when access for redress or testimonies in a regular way are not to be had." Unquote. If the above instances do not affect the essentials, and bar up from redress and a necessary testimony, I know not what will do it. Objection. Presbyterian, dissenting ministers, etc., are not prosecuted or persecuted for owning the covenants and Reformation principles, but for their divisive and seditious courses from the present establishment, and so they may blame themselves. Answer. The ministers above mentioned have again and again declared and published their principles to the world, and are to be seen at large in the Informatory Vindication reprinted 1707, Mr. Macmillan's Declinature printed 1708, the Renovation of the Covenants near Douglas printed 1713, the Humble Pleadings printed 1713, etc., all which contain the sum and substance of the principles of our Reformers, which the Church in purer and better times owned. And they hold to what the Greater Assembly of Divines at Westminster publicly professed, what the three kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland once nationally professed, as reformed according to the Word, and were legally established and secured by their respective parliaments, Anons 1640, 1641, 1644, 1645, 1648, 1649, and 1651. Which principles have been sealed with the blood of the noble Marquis of Argyle, Warriston, the Reverend Messrs. James Guthrie, Kidd, King, Cargill, and Hugh McKeel, James Mitchell, Walter Smith, James Bogg, John Dick, Cameron and Rennick, and the rest of the noble cloud of witnesses, following the laudable practice of the Church of Christ in the Reforming period. Dissenters willingly take and subscribe the Covenants National and Solemn League as the terms of their communion in obedience to the standing discipline of their mother church. See Assembly 1638, Session 26, Assembly 1643, Session 6, Assembly 1647, Assembly 1648, Session 31, and the Act of the Commission of the Assembly the same year. And if any call this heresy, they may make answer with the great apostle, quote, "After the way which they call heresy, so worship they the God of their fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets," unquote. Acts 24, verse 14. Whence 'tis clear, the objection is null and without ground, and hence the persecution and tyranny of this church must proceed from another spring against these men than division from the covenanted Reformation. And if a firm adherence to our true Reformed Protestant Presbyterian principles cannot stand or consist with the present establishment, every true Presbyterian will rather drop the latter than renounce the former. And I am of the mind, this being put in practice by these dissenting ministers, their contending for the good old way, and the faith once delivered unto the saints, in the ground, is the ground of this church, her unwarrantable prejudice at them, and persecution of them. Now, for aught I know, 'tis the unanimous opinion of all orthodox divines that the tyranny in government itself is a justifiable and warrantable ground of separation from any church whatsoever, and I wish there were not too many instances to prove this Revolution Church guilty of the same. Reason 6. I'm of the mind Presbyterian dissenters may or do see just ground to dissent from this Revolution Church, because she has gone into and practically approving of the incorporating union with prelatic constitution of England as, number 1, this church, in concurring with, acquiescing in, and going into the union establishment, hath made herself accessory to and guilty of many heinous sins and miserable effects thereof upon these lands. For though, when this woeful union was in agitation and on 1706, ministers did or said little to discover the sinfulness and evil thereof, and even the Commission's address against it improved not the topics whence strongest arguments might have been drawn against it, that is, our covenants, etc. Yet, when they had obtained that new Erastian establishment of the Church, and annual assemblies in their Windlestraw Act of Security, they became yet more sinfully silent and unfaithful, insomuch that they withdrew even the representations which they had presented unto the Parliament concerning the said union. For they had never honesty and faithfulness to protest against it, which deed of the Commission was in the most ample form approven of, and they praised for managing so agreeably to their instructions by the subsequent assembly. See the 9th Act of Assembly 1707, and here a footnote, wherein the General Assembly did by their vote and hereby do unanimously ratify and approve the actings and proceedings of the said Commission contained in their registers, and do commend and thank them for the great zeal, faithfulness, and diligence which they have evidenced in their said proceedings, etc. This seems to be a treacherous dealing. Number 2. In that Act of Security, securing the Revolution Church, repeated in the English exemplification, the worship, discipline, and government of this Church is only secured, whereas the Exemplification Act not only establishes and unalterably secures the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government of the Church of England, but also the whole liturgy, rites, and ceremonies thereof, as then by law established in England, as also all the acts of Parliament then in force, made in favours thereof, are appointed to remain in full force forever. And, by virtue of the said act, all kings and queens at their coronation are obliged to take and subscribe an oath to maintain and preserve inviolable the said establishment of the Church of England, as then established by law in the kingdoms of England and Ireland, and Dominion of Wales, town of Berwick upon Tweed, and the territories thereunto belonging, etc., which is both a far better security in favours of the Church of England than that other securing the Revolution Church, and also better observed as the Yule Vacants, Act of Toleration, and acts enjoining and imposing the abjuration oaths do witness, which acts securing the foresaid churches, as above, are to be held and observed in all time coming, quote, as fundamental and essential conditions of the said union, and shall be taken to be, and are hereby declared to be essential and fundamental parts of the said acts and union." Unquote. Number 3. This union establishment of this church foresaid becomes, firstly, a foundation of the union, secondly, a confirmation of Erastianism, thirdly, a disclaiming our sworn duty of endeavoring England's Reformation, fourthly, a consenting to the perpetual and unalterable establishment of abjured prelacy in England and Ireland, and so, fifthly, an avowed continuance of perjury and breach of covenant. Hence, sixthly, these two opposite churches, the one professedly Scripture and the other anti-scriptural, by unhappy conjunction are essentially unite. And seventhly, an open consenting to the sapping the foundation of our ancient church and nation, having thereby lost the very name of a kingdom, and has got that name of reproach, that is, that part of Great Britain called Scotland, a poor pitiful pendicle of England, to the perpetual shame of all true Scotsmen. Number 4. In the last article of the said union I find, quote, "All laws and statutes in either kingdom, so far as they are contrary to or inconsistent with the terms of these articles, or any of them, shall from and after the union cease and become void, and so be declared to be by the respective parliaments of the said kingdoms." Unquote. Which accordingly was done, as is to be seen in the act of exemplification foresaid, whereby, as would seem, all preceding acts, statutes, and ordinances made by the parliaments of Scotland and England in favours of our glorious covenanted work of uniformity, in reformation of religion, in prosecution of the ends of the solemn league and covenant in these three kingdoms, are now de novo rescinded and abolished, which seems to merit the title of a second recissory act, and that by the parliaments of both kingdoms, for without debate, if there was any act or acts, either standing unrepealed, or, being once repealed and cast, or restored or revived by any laws or statutes before the Union, in favours of the covenanted work of uniformity in religion, nobody will say such are agreeable to, or consistent with, the articles of the Union, and, if they are not, then in the foresaid act of exemplification, they are all formally rescinded and made void. And this Revolution Church, by going into the Union, seems to have given their Amen thereunto, which renders that blessed uniformity in doctrine, worship, discipline, and government, by having one and the same confession of faith, form of Presbyterian church government, directory for worship, and catechisms, etc., sworn to, as we are by the first article of the solemn league and covenant, bound to maintain for all time coming, impossible and impractical in these three kingdoms, Scotland, England, and Ireland. Number 5. Now nobody except through ignorance has the least ground to deny that this present church did go into and improves the Union establishment, seeing the contrary, I mean the affirmative, is so evident from their own addresses, representations, etc., insert in their public records. See the 15th Act of the Assembly, 1707, the commission of their addresses to Queen Anne and British Parliament, recorded in the 10th Act of Assembly, 1712, the Assembly in their 2 addresses to the Queen, recorded in the 16th and 17th Acts of Assembly, 1712, the Assembly's address to the Queen, recorded in the 12th Act of Assembly, 1714, in all which this church doth, in the most express and ample form, and strongest terms imaginable, plead upon the acts of ratification and exemplification foresaid, for the safety of their own privileges, secured unto them by the foresaid Treaty of Union. See also the 14th Act of Assembly, 1711, and the 9th Act of the Assembly, 1715, etc. Oh, how inconsistent with the principles of Scots Presbyterians, sworn with uplifted hands to the great God, to extirpate prelacy, etc., once to seek much more to allow the security of their church upon such a sinful basis as contains in it an explicit eradication of the covenanted Reformation of England, which we are solemnly bound to endeavour, and is the very bane of Reformation in Scotland, destructive to all our civil and religious concerns, as sad experience doth daily testify. Surely our forefathers would have withstood, even to blood, such a heterogeneous corporation, as hath involved the nation into the deepest perjury, thereby effectually burying and laying the gravestone upon the covenanted reformation of the three kingdoms, and whereby also Scotland hath united themselves to, and are become the tail of our neighbour nation, according to the curse denounced against the rebellious Israelites in Deuteronomy 28, verse 13. And it may be looked upon as a just judgment from the Lord upon us of this degenerate and backslidden and still backsliding race, for our shameful desertion and recession from the zeal and faithfulness of these burning and shining lights, our Reformers, who by the good hand of God upon them wrestled up our Reformation to such a height as was not the attainment of any church since the primitive days, and for base neutrality with respect to the covenants and cause of God in his leaving this church and nation to go in with, and consent unto, this unhallowed union, the gall of which the most part of the nation hath been made to taste, which is yet but the beginning of sorrows, especially with respect to religion.